In this video, we're going to look at how to integrate the Airtable SDK into Next.js serverless functions so that we can create, read, update, and delete all of our information inside of Airtable. Now, if you want to follow along with the entire series, make sure to go back and watch part 1. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and get started. So we have our environment variable set up for Airtable. Now let's move over and look at how to create some API routes that will integrate with Airtable and help do the work for us to get the data that we need. So we need to start by installing the Airtable npm package. So you run an npm install of Airtable. And if you look inside of the Airtable docs, so if you remember the Airtable API docs here that we got to earlier, there's a JavaScript section. And if you look for just listing records, this thing will show you how to do a select and grab all the records that you need. I'm going to go ahead and rerun my server. And then let's go ahead and create inside of our API, let's create a new file for get to do. So this is going to be the API endpoint that will go and get all of the to-dos from Airtable. I think we got a little bit of a problem in here inside of our nav bar. Looks like we're using class instead of class name. So let me make sure that that is not happening anywhere else. I think that should do it. So that looks successful. So inside of our get to dos, let's try to figure out how we're going to do this. So the basic structure for an API function is we're going to export a default, and you can see this inside of the hello world here. We'll export a default function that takes in a request and a response. And actually, let's just copy that and bring it over here. So if you've done any sort of work with Node.js and Express, the request response callback function here probably seems kind of familiar to you. So hopefully this is not anything too new. And so inside of here, we've got our function definition, and now we need to work with Airtable. Well, I'm going to come back and I'm going to copy the code for getting the Airtable, getting a reference to the Airtable base. So I just copy this in, and what I'm going to do is update this a little bit and say this is going to be a const Airtable, this is a const base, and then I'm going to say const table equals base to do. So the thing that we want to do is update this to reference our environment variables. So to do this, we will update our API key. So this API key is actually going to be process.env.airtable API key. And then our base is going to be process.env.airtable base ID. And if you're new to the process.env here, this is how this is where Next.js is picking up those environment variables from this .env file and then giving us access to them inside of process.env. So the last one we'll do is process.env.airtable, table name is what we called it. So at the end of all this, we should have a reference to the actual table that we want to query from. If we copy in, I'm going to copy this and bring it over, and we'll change the way we do this a little bit, but inside of here, we're wanting to use this base, which we already have a reference to. So we've already got our table. So this part here is getting that to do table. We've already got that. So we can call select on that. And we don't really want to have any max records. That's okay. So we can get rid of it. And then we don't need to specify a view. So we can actually get rid of that as well. And I'm going to change this up a little bit here where we are going to call select. And what select will do is it will basically just kind of give us kind of a cursor that we can work with for getting information out of that table. So by not passing any properties, this is not doing any filtering or anything. This is going to kind of get all the records. But Airtable kind of works on pagination. So what we want to do is actually get the first page of the results. So by default, Airtable will give you 20 records back, and then we could elaborate on this later on to do some sort of pagination if we wanted to. Now, I like using async await for my asynchronous JavaScript. So I'm going to mark this as an async function up here. And then I'm going to say const records equals await table.select. And then we can return back that data. So let's bring this code down here. We'll return a 200, and then we will return the records that came from Airtable. So in theory, what's going to happen is when we make a request to this get to do's endpoint, it's going to go and get a reference to this table up here. It will do a select, grab the first page of those documents, and then give us those records back. So let's take a look and see if that will work. All right, so we've got our localhost 3000 here. I'm going to zoom in so maybe you can see this a little bit bigger. And we'll do API/get to dos. And you see that this actually came back with data, which is pretty cool. So inside of this array, we have an object for each record. And each record has really the only things we care about is the ID of that record and then the fields of that record. And notice here that our completed field isn't here. And the reason is this is a bit odd, but Airtable doesn't send back the completed field if it's a checkbox and it is empty. So we'll have to kind of handle that here in a second. But one of the things I would like to do is kind of minify this data because I don't really care about all of this other information. I really just care about the ID and the fields. So I'm going to create a new function, Minify Records, actually record. So we're going to minify an individual record. And what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if there is no record.fields.completed, then we want to manually set that thing to false. So we'll say record.fields.completed equals false. This way, for every record that we get, we'll minify this thing and put it in a format that's going to be minified, but also make sure that it has that completed field. So then at the end of this, we're going to return a new object, and the ID of this will be the record.id. And then we'll just take in or grab all of the fields from that record and put it in the fields property. So this will return a simplified object of this. But then we want to do this for each one of our records. So let's actually create a new helper function called Minify Records. And this will take in an array of records. And what we want to do is map or iterate through each record and return back the minified version of that. So we can actually do a records.map, get a reference to each record. And then for each one of those, we want to return the minified record. And I should update this to get minified record. So we want to get the minified record of that record, if that makes sense. So what this thing will do is it will iterate through each record. It'll get a reference to the individual one, and then it will return the minified version of that. So map returns an array, so we can just return back that whole thing. And then lastly in here, we can say const minified records equals minify records and pass those in. And so the output of this should be a more simple or a simplified version of those records. So let's come back to our serverless function and let's test this out again. It looks like we get an internal server error here. What is this one? Cannot access minified records before initialize. So we'll need to move this one up here since it references the other. So let's try this out again. Let's call this API endpoint here. And I think both of these, well, actually this function call here should be get minified record. And actually it should be get minified records. Really need to work on the typing here. So there is, hopefully that is spelled right. I think I really botched the naming on these. So let's go ahead and double check this. This should be minify records. And then this one should be get minified record. So this one should be minify records. I really botched that. Another typo here. All right, and now this is able to run after fixing all those typos. And now we see here are 3 records, and these are in much more simplified versions. So we can see the completed Booleans here, as well as the descriptions. And notice that this completed actually comes after the description. That's because we manually added that property because it doesn't come by default. All right, now we are going to end up using a lot of this logic, actually all of this logic, in each of the different CRUD operations for working with Airtable. So we will have create, read, update, and delete. So we'll do those things 4 times. So let's go and create a utils directory inside of API. So there's our utils directory. And let's create an Airtable.js file. And then all of those helper functions that we just created, let's cut those, let's copy them and paste them into this new file. And then at the end of that, let's export those helper functions so that we can use them in other files. So we're going to export the table, the get minified record, and the minify records function here. So we'll export those things so we can use them in various different places. All right, so with those things exported, now we can actually come in and import those up here. So we will import the table, the get, and the minify records from util/Airtable. All right, if we save this, hopefully what we'll see is this continues to work the exact same, but now we've got some reusable code that we can use in those other CRUD operations. All right, that's looking really good. Now, the last thing we want to do in this file is make sure that we handle any errors that might happen. So we'll surround this with a try catch. And if there's an error, let's copy this. We want to return back. We won't be too specific, but we'll say 500 of the status. And then we'll have an object with a message inside of it that is something went wrong. Now, hopefully nothing does go wrong, but just in case it does, we'll go ahead and log that out. So this is our function for being able to get our to-dos. Now we can go into our API and we can create a new file for create to-dos.js. So I'm going to copy all of what we just had from our create to-dos because we'll use some of the same stuff in here. And this might actually be more aptly named for create to do because we're going to create an individual one. But now instead of doing table.select, we're actually going to do a table.create. And then the way create works inside of Airtable is it's going to take an array of objects that have a fields property. So we want to pass in one object that we're going to create, and it's going to have a fields property. And inside of that fields property, it's going to have a description. And so we're going to need to get that description from somewhere. Well, it's going to come from the body of this request. So we can say the body equals rec.body, and then we can say description equals body.description. We can shorten this just a bit by going ahead and exporting the description property or destructuring this description property off of the request.body. So here's the description that comes in this post request. And then we're passing in an array of objects, in this case, just one object, and that object should have a property called fields. And that thing will be an object that will have a property of description, which will come from here. And so typically this would be typed out all the way like this, but since the key and the value are the same name, we can just do a shorthand like that. So this will no longer be records. This will be the created record. And actually Airtable will return an array of records that will be created. So what comes back actually is an array of created records. And then what we want to do is grab the one record that is relevant to us. So we will say const created record, and then we'll just grab the ID from created records from the first item. So there's the index of 0. We'll grab the ID, and then we'll say this is fields of created record 0.fields. So now created record is the thing that we want to return, and we can return back that created record like so. So we're no longer going to be able to test this since this is a post request inside of our browser. We're going to have to open up a tool like Postman to be able to send our different post, put, and delete methods. So I'm going to scroll over and I'm going to grab my Postman and I'm going to create a new tab in here and just paste in the URL that we're looking for. So this is localhost 3000 API, but instead of get to dos, we're going to call create to do. And then inside of Postman, we want to add a body. So I will choose raw and then JSON. And the only thing we need to pass inside of this object is the description. So this is a test to do number 4. All right, so let's go ahead and try to make that request as long as we update this to a post request. All right, let's go ahead and run that. We get an error here to say something went wrong. And what we didn't do is we didn't log out the error. So let's make sure that we are logging this out so we can actually see what went wrong. So let's try to trigger this request again. We'll come back and see what the error is. Cannot access created record before initialization. Well, that's because I've got typos all over the place today. That should be our created records, and we're getting the specific one. So let's try to run this again. And now you see that this was actually created. So if we scroll back over and come into Airtable, we should see that now we've got our test to do number 4 3 times. So it looks like that actually worked 3 times, or the 2 times we didn't think it worked, it actually did that part. So that will work. Let's actually run that one more time because I want to get this specific ID. So this should be the ID of the latest item that just got created inside of here. So we've got that working pretty well. Now we'll want to create a new API called update to do. And again, this will look very similar to our create to do. So I'm going to grab all of this code, paste it into here. And we don't need this Minify Records. We didn't need it in the last one, but that's okay. So from the incoming body, we want to grab the ID and the fields. So we need the ID to know which record to update, and then we need the fields to be able to update those fields. And then similar to this create, we'll call update in here. And what update now will take is an array of objects, but these objects have two properties. It has an ID, so we'll grab that ID field that we got up here, and then it has a fields, and we will grab those fields from what comes into the body. So this is saying for each object that's inside of this array, we want to update the record with this ID with these new fields. And then we can just call this thing updated record, and let's just return that thing. And we could minify this if we wanted to. We don't really need to. Actually, it might be useful. So let's go ahead and import the get minified record function, and then we'll just return the get minified record of that updated record. So that will strip out all of the things that we don't necessarily need. So that looks like it should be good to go. Let's come back over to our Postman, and let's make this now a put request. And this will be to the update to do. And then now we'll type in two things. So we'll need to grab this ID down here. So let's just grab this whole, actually, let's grab this entire thing, because this is exactly what it's going to look like. So let's paste that in, and maybe we can leave the description alone, and now we'll update the completed property to be true. So we'll try to update that to do item to now be completed inside of Airtable. Let's go ahead and send this along, and we get something went wrong. We've seen that several times before. Cannot read property completed of undefined. And I think that's because just like when we create to-dos, this returns an array of the updated records. So here's our updated records, and then we want the first record that got updated. So now let's give this a shot and see if that works a little bit better. Let's try to update this thing. So we see now that something gets returned. So we see these properties have been updated. Seems like it worked well in there. And now we see that this has been updated to be completed. We could also update the description if we wanted to. So we could say updated description up here, and then go ahead and send that. And now in Airtable, we should be able to see this as well. So there's our updated version. And that's working really well. The last thing inside of our API routes that we want to add is the delete to do JS. And again, just to kind of save us some effort here, I'm going to copy over the code from our update to do. And in this case, from the body, all we want is the ID. And then we will call the table.destroy, and destroy will take an array of not objects, but just IDs. So we'll say these are the deleted records. And instead of just selecting, and then we can do the same thing we did before, but now we'll say these are the deleted records, and we'll show the one that just got deleted. Now, if we were deleting more than one, if we were allowing that to happen, we could minify all of these records and return all of them. In this case, we know we're really only deleting one. So we can save this thing here. We can scroll over, and let's just get rid of the fields part. And let's make this a delete request, and let's send that request to delete to do, and get rid of this comma. And then hopefully what we'll see is this thing will go ahead and delete that thing. It looks like maybe it did. So let's come back over, and you see that that was in fact deleted, which is pretty nice. So now we have API routes for all of our CRUD operations: create, read, update, and delete in Airtable. Now we can start to look at how do we tie this into our front end. So the next thing we'll do is inside of our index.js file, we're going to use a function called get server-side props in Next.js. And this goes back to the idea of Next.js being very flexible, but also very powerful, of giving you the ability to have server-side rendered pages as well as statically generated pages. And in this case, we're going to take advantage of those server-side rendered pages. So what we're going to do is we will export an async function called get server side props. And this thing takes in a context as the parameter, and then we'll open and close that function just like that. So again, this is a function that is built in or just kind of natively supported by Next.js. And what this will do is it will run this function before it actually serves this page, before it serves the index.js page. So what we want to do is inside of here, go and grab all of the to-do items out of Airtable and then pass them in as a prop to our home component here. So we can kind of work with the stuff that we've already been doing, where we can import our Airtable helper stuff. And I'm going to copy in and import here. We can import our table and then our Minify Records function from, and we'll have to go back or go into our API route into utils and then into Airtable. So we'll import those things. And then similar to how we do inside of our actual API routes, now we'll just go ahead and grab all of those. So we'll say const to-dos equals await table, and then we'll do a select, pass in empty parameters there, and then call first page. Now, again, this is just going to get the first page of records. For this demo, we're not going to have a ton of records, so that ought to cover us pretty good. And then what we'll do is we'll return an object that has a property of props. And then on or inside of the props object, we'll have an initial to-dos object. And this is going to be a minified version. So we're going to minify records of those to-dos. So then we'll be able to accept those things as props up here inside of our home component. So we'll actually, we could just take in props, or we can go ahead and destructure and grab those initial to-dos. All right. And one last thing we'll want to do is make sure we're always handling our errors if we have any. And so we'll do our try catch here. And if there is an error, we will return an error. And then we could probably log out that error. And then we could also return, if there's some sort of issue, return back something as a property. Now, I don't know exactly what I would do here, but maybe we could return back an error message. So we'll just say this error is something went wrong. So we're not going too deep into this. We don't really plan on anything going wrong. If it does, we'll send that error into the application. Now, with this stuff up and running, what we can do is use these to-dos and we can go ahead and log them out. So let's log out our initial to-dos. All right, so now if we refresh on the homepage for our application, so localhost 3000, if we refresh this and then open up our console, we should see that now we see these records. So we've got our ID and our field. So we're able to get all of those records, which is really nice. And now our next step is to keep track of all of these records inside of state inside of our application. So in the next video, we'll take a look at integrating the context API in Next.js.